What is something that was once considered to be a legend or myth that eventually turned out to be true? One of my favorites is Lake Nyas in the Republic of Cameroon. The local legend was that an evil spirit or a monster lived in the lake and would come out at night to kill anyone who lived too close to the lake. One of the local groups, the Bafmen, settled in the high ground near the lake due to the legends. Different groups moved into the area in the mid-1900s and lived closer to the water's edge, disregarding the customs of the Bafmen. In 1986, nearly 1,500 people living near the lake were found dead. Those who lived in the higher ground were fine. It turns out the lake was very deep and would essentially become carbonated. A landslide could trigger a release of CO2 from the lake waters. On that night in 1986, an enormous release occurred, and since CO2 is heavier than air, anyone in the lower areas simply suffocated and didn't wake up. So while the myth about the evil spirits wasn't entirely true, there really was something in the lake to fear. It wasn't clear whether King Richard III was really deformed, or if people who wrote about him after he died were just making it up. Some people thought he must have been physically normal, but writers added the deformity to make him seem more hateable. When his remains were found, there was evidence of severe scoliosis that would have made one shoulder higher than the other. Not a hunchback, but at least a bit lopsided. For a few hundred years the Micronesians, a Stone Age culture, had the fastest sailboats in the world. The first few reports of how fast the boats went were derided as fantasy. It wasn't until George Anson made actual measurements and drawings in the 1740s it was taken seriously. In the 1960s there were rumors that the US government had been carrying out secret germ warfare tests on its own citizens. These rumors were strongly denied. Then in the 1970s, when pressed by Senate hearings, the military admitted that, between 1949 and 1969, such tests had taken place, most notably on the New York subway system. Mountaineers found a small lake in the Himalayas, absolutely covered in bones. As they searched, they found the bodies of at least 200, as well as potentially up to 3 times that many in the lake itself. All of them died of blunt force trauma from what appeared to be a rock slide, but there was no sign of any such rocks. According to legend, Raja Jastaval, the king of Kannauj, was traveling with his pregnant wife, Rani Palampa. They were accompanied by servants, a dance troupe, and others as they traveled on a pilgrimage to Nanda Devi Shrine for the Nanda Devi Rajjat, which takes place every 12 years. As they traveled, they were overcome by a sudden, severe hailstorm with extremely large hailstones. The storm was too strong, and with nowhere to take shelter, the entire group perished. It was long thought to be a legend, but now they think it actually happened, almost exactly the way it was said to have happened. Ball lightning is pretty fascinating. There have been anecdotal reports of it for hundreds of years, but it was hard to document because it doesn't last long and it couldn't be photographed. It's also hard to create it in a lab, but it is acknowledged now that it does exist. I first read about it in one of the Little House on the Prairie books and thought it was wild. I wasn't sure if it was real or some kind of hallucination. Saraswati River in India was considered a myth, a stuff of mythological texts and such. No one could actually confirm its existence, but there was a millennia-long speculation about why did the river feature so much in late Bronze Age Vedic Indian literature. If it was not real, alongside actual and real major rivers, it was even deified as a goddess, a prospect reserved for major rivers, yet no one had an idea about where it was later on. Fast forward to 19th century, Indians and the British surveying the land discovered an entire dry river valley in the middle of the desert, not far from location mentioned in ancient texts. It roughly runs behind the modern India-Pakistan border. Many wondered where the lush and prosperous Saraswati floodplain mentioned in Vedic texts went, and why did the river dry up? The most common theory today is that the river, while real, suffered drastic effects in the massive climate change of late 6th century AD, and lost its course. The mention of it in imperial texts disappears by the next century, Parts of the river lingered around until 9th century, but increasing desertification eventually killed it completely, and the river passed from memory. It remains like that today, just a faintly recognizable river valley in the middle of the desert. Kangaroos were once classified as cryptids along with Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, etc. Before it was established that they kept their babies in their pouches, it was told that they were creatures with two heads. Makes me think what other cryptids we actually are just seeing wrong. I've mentioned this before in a similar thread, but I'm seriously surprised no one's mentioned the Green Man yet. Basically, people thought they were seeing a ghost on a certain road, and it turned out to be a person out on night walks who was heavily mutilated as a child due to an electrical accident. In Paris they would mine limestone in near darkness. They only had a green light to help them out. Sometimes the oxygen would run out, and people would hallucinate and see other people with their green lights coming for them. When they got out, they'd be sure they saw a green man chasing them. In reality, it was other miners trying to get out of the mines. North Korean kidnappings of some Japanese people. They were just rumors and a myth for a while, but then NK came out and admitted that they totally did it. Prion diseases like mad cow and fatal familial insomnia and Kuru. They are caused by a protein malformation and yet are communicable, which was thought to be impossible by epidemiologists. And yet here we are with prion diseases caused by genetics, fatal familial insomnia, by consumption of brain tissue, mad cow, Creutzfeldt Jakob, Kuru, and now by pathogen chronic wasting disease. The case was essentially cracked in part by a teenager in Italy. The scientist who first made the discovery in Papua New Guinea was a pedo, so he was discredited, which is part of why it took so long. There's a fascinating book called The Family That Couldn't Sleep, I think, that traces a history and the science behind prions. Well, not quite a perfect fit, but the one that always sticks in my mind was that the Mongolians would always boil their water before drinking to get rid of the tiny evil spirits. That's a pretty good description of germs and bacteria for the time period. The discovery of Viking Norse colony at Lansauk's Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, that was settled between 990-1050. Rumors of Norse landings in North America were dubious, often alluded to in the Icelandic or Greenlander sagas as the colony of Vinland. In 1961, a colony was located, excavated and dated to over 400 years prior to Columbus. The Hon Kim turtle was a legendary creature living in Hon Kim Lake in Vietnam. In the 15th century, the golden turtle god Kim Kui appeared to the Emperor of Vietnam and gave him a sword. After a war with the Chinese, the turtle reappeared and took back the sword. Sightings of the mythical turtle persisted on and off for hundreds of years, until in 1967 a fisherman actually found or caught the turtle and beat it to death with a crowbar. Multiple sightings since then confirmed the turtle or turtles in the lake are very similar to or possible the same creature as a Yank's giant soft-shelled turtle. The Black Swan. It used to be used as a phrase to mean something that was impossible to exist, or an affront to nature. Then they sailed into the Swan River in Western Australia, and lo and behold, there they were. Not quite a myth, but Jonathan Swift wrote in Gulliver's Travels 1726 about Mars having two moons about 150 years before they were discovered in 1877. He got their distances from Mars and orbital periods not ridiculously wrong, either. Lots of animals and things from other continents, narwhals, platypuses, and manatees come to mind. I believe there exists an oral history of a tremendous wave striking the Pacific Northwest among various coastal tribes. It was broadly viewed as being nonsense before they uncovered evidence of a colossal thrust earthquake and tsunami from around 1700. Gorillas. Giant squid. Before they were documented, they only existed in stories for a long time. The city of Troy. Cropsey. I remember him being brought up in a thread many years ago in the early days of Something Awful, in a What's a Local Scary Thing for You thread. was just a spooky myth about a spooky boogeyman who lived in the steam tunnels under CUNY Staten Island and Willowbrook State School, who kidnapped and murdered little kids. Turns out he was a real dude called Ray Rand who kidnapped and murdered an estimated 5 children and special needs adults over a period of 12 years in the 70s and 80s. He had been in prison since 1988 for kidnapping, but came back into the spotlight in 2004 when he was brought to trial and convicted for a second kidnapping. New York State lacks a statute of limitations on kidnapping. In 2009, a documentary, from what I understand it is very sensational and plays up the supernatural devil worship scare angle, called Cropsy, was released. Consider subscribing if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more of Reddit Universe.